Chapter 24 of Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. Chapter 24. Kinnison approached star cluster AC 2574736 warily, as before. And as before, he insinuated his speedster through the loose outer cordon of guardian fortresses. This time, however, he did not steer even remotely near Helmuth's world. He would be there too long. There was altogether too much risk of electromagnetic detection to set his ship into any kind of an orbit around that planet. Instead, he had computed a long, narrow elliptical orbit around its sun, well inside the zone guarded by the Maulers. He could compute it only approximately, of course, since he did not know exactly either the masses involved or the perturbing forces, but he thought that he could find his ship again with an electro. If not, she would not be an irreplaceable loss. He set the speedster, then, into the outward leg of that orbit, and took off in his new armor. He knew that there was a thought screen around Helmuth's planet, and suspected that there might be other screens as well. Therefore, shutting off every watt of power, he dropped straight down into the night side, well clear of the citadel's edge. His flares were, of course, heavily baffled, but even so he did not put on his brakes until it was absolutely necessary. He landed heavily, then sprang away in long free hops, until he reached his previously selected destination, a great cavern thickly shielded with iron ore, and fully 5,000 miles from his point of descent. Deep within that cavern he hid himself, then searched intently for any sign that his approach had been observed. There was no such sign. So far, so good. But during his search he had perceived with a slight shock that Helmuth had tightened his defenses even more. Not only was every man in the dome screened against thought, but also each was now wearing full armor. Had he protected the dogs, too, or killed them? No real matter if he had. Any kind of a pet animal would do, or in a pinch, even a wild rock lizard. Nevertheless, he shot his perception into the particular barracks he had noted so long before, and found with some relief that the dogs were still there, and that they were still unprotected. It had not occurred, even to Helmuth's cautious mind, that a dog could be a source of mental danger. With all due precaution against getting even a single grain of the stuff in his own system, Kinnison transferred his thionite into the special container in which it was to be used. Another day sufficed to observe and to memorize the personnel of the Gateway observers, their positions, and the sequence in which they took the boards. Then the Lensmen, still almost a week ahead of schedule, settled down to await the time when he should make his next move. Nor was this waiting unduly irksome. Now that everything was ready, he could be as patient as a cat on duty at a mouse hole. The time came to act. Kinnison took over the mind of the dog, which at once moved over to the bunk in which one particular observer lay asleep. There would be no chance whatever of gaining control of any observer while he was actually on the board, but here in barracks it was almost ridiculously easy. The dog crept along on soundless paws. A long, slim nose reached out and up. Sharp teeth closed delicately upon a battery lead. Out came the plug. The thought screen went down, and instantly Kinnison was in charge of the fellow's mind. And when that observer went on duty, his first act was to admit Kimball Kinnison, Gray Lensman, to the grand base of Boskoni. Low and fast Kinnison flew, while the observer so placed his body as to shield from any chance passer-by the all-too-revealing surface of his visiplate. In a few minutes the Lensman reached a portal of the dome itself. Those doors also opened, and closed behind him. He released the mind of the observer and watched briefly. Nothing happened. All was still well. Then, in every barracks save one, using whatever came to hand in the way of dog or unshielded animal, Kinnison wrought briefly but effectively. He did not slay by mental force. He did not have enough of that to spare, but the mere turn of an inconspicuous valve would do just as well. Some of those now idle men would probably live to answer Helmuth's call to extra duty, but not too many, nor would those who obeyed that summons live long thereafter. Down stairway after stairway he dived, down to the compartment in which was housed the great air purifier. Now let them come. Even if they had a spy ray on him, now it would be too late to do them a bit of good, And now, by all the gods of space, that fleet had better be out there, getting ready to blast. It was. From all over the galaxy, that grand fleet had been assembled. Every patrol base had been stripped of almost everything mobile that could throw a beam. Every vessel carried either a Lensman or some other highly trusted officer, and each such officer had 2 detector nullifiers, one upon his person, the other in his locker, either one of which would protect his whole ship from detection. In long lines, singly and at intervals, those untold thousands of ships had crept between the vessels guarding Grand Base. Nor were the outpost crews to blame. They had been on duty for months, and not even an asteroid had relieved the monotony. Nothing had happened, or would. They watched their plates steadily enough, and if they did nothing more, why should they? And what could they have done? How could they suspect that such a thing as a detector nullifier had been invented? The patrol's grand fleet, then, was already massing over its primary objectives, each vessel in a rigidly assigned position. The pilots, captains, and navigators were chatting amongst themselves, jerkily and in low voices, as though even to raise their voices might reveal prematurely to the enemy the concentration of the patrol forces. The firing officers were already at their boards, eyeing hungrily the small switches, which they could not throw for so many long minutes yet. And far below, beside the pirate's air purifier, Kinnison released the locking toggles of his armor and leaped out. To burn a hole in the primary duct took only a second. To drop into that duct his container of thionite, to drench that container with the reagent, which would in 60 seconds dissolve completely that container's substance, without affecting either its contents or the metal of the duct, to slap a flexible adhesive patch over the hole in the duct, and to leap back into his armor. All these things required only a trifle over 1 minute. 11 minutes to go. QX. Then, in the last barracks, even while the Lensman was arrowing up the stairways, a dog again deprived a sleeping man of his thought screen. That man, however, instead of going to work, took up a pair of pliers and proceeded to cut the battery leads of every sleeper in the barracks, severing them so close that no connection could be made without removing the armor. As those leads were severed, men woke up and dashed into the dome. Along catwalk after catwalk they raced, and apparently that was all that they were doing. But each runner, as he passed a man on duty, flicked a battery plug out of its socket, and that observer, at Kinnison's command, opened the faceplate of his armor and breathed deeply of the now drug-laden atmosphere. Thionite, as has been intimated, is perhaps the worst of all known habit-forming drugs. In almost infinitesimal doses, it gives rise to a state in which the victim seems actually to experience the gratification of his every desire, whatever that desire may be. The larger the dose, the more intense the sensation, until, and very quickly, the dosage is reached at which he passes into such an ecstatic stupor that not even a single nerve can force a stimulus into his frenzied brain. In this stage he dies. Thus there was no alarm, no outcry, no warning. Each observer sat or stood entranced, holding exactly the pose he had been in at the instant of opening his faceplate. But now, instead of paying attention to his duty, he was plunging deeper and deeper into the paroxysmally ecstatic profundity of a thionite debauch, from which there was to be no awakening. Therefore half of that mighty dome was unmanned, before Helmuth even realized that anything at all out of order was going on. As soon as he realized that something was amiss, however, he sounded the all-hands-on-duty alarm, and rapped out instructions to the officers in the barracks. But the cloud of death had arrived there first, and to his consternation not 1/4 of those officers responded. Quite a number of men did get into the dome, but every one of them collapsed before reaching the catwalks, and 3/4 of his working force were hors de combat before he located Kinnison's speeding messengers. "Blast them down!" Helmuth shrieked, pointing, gesticulating madly. "Blast whom down?" The minions of the Lensmen were themselves blasting away now, right and left, shouting contradictory but supposedly authoritative orders. "Blast those men not on duty!" Helmuth's raging voice now filled the dome. "You, at board 479, blast that man on catwalk 28, at board 495." With such detailed instructions, Kinnison's agents one by one ceased to be. But as one was beamed down, another took his place, and soon every one of the few remaining living pirates in the dome was blasting indiscriminately at every other one. And then, to cap the Saturnalian climax, came the 0 second. The grand fleet of the Galactic Patrol had assembled. Every cruiser, every battleship, every mauler, hung poised above its assigned target. Every vessel was stripped for action. Every accumulator cell was full to its ultimate watt. Every generator and every arm was tuned and peaked to its highest attainable efficiency. Every firing officer upon every ship sat tensely at his board, his hand hovering near, but not touching, his firing keys, his eyes fixed glaringly upon the second hand of his synchronized electric timer, his ears scarcely hearing the droning, soothing voice of Port Admiral Haynes. For the old man had insisted upon giving the firing order himself, and he now sat at the master timer, speaking into the master microphone. Beside him sat von Hohendorf, the grand old commandant of cadets. Both of these veterans had thought long since that they were done with space war forever, but only an order of the full Galactic Council could have kept either of them at home. They were grimly determined that they were going to be in at the death, even though they were not at all certain whose death it was to be. If it should turn out that it was Helmuth's, all well and good. Everything would be on the green. If, on the other hand, young Kinnison had to go, they would, in all probability, have to go too, and so be it. Now remember, boys, keep your hands off those keys until I give you the word. Haynes' soothing voice droned on, giving no hint of the terrific strain he himself was under. I'll give you lots of warning. I'm going to count the last 5 seconds for you. I know that you all want to shoot the first bolt, but remember that I, personally, will strangle any and every one of you who beats my signal by 1,000th of a second. It won't be long now. The second hand is starting around on its last lap. Keep your hands off those keys. Keep away from them, I tell you, or I'll smack you down. 15 seconds yet. Stay away, boys. Let them alone. Going to start counting now. His voice dropped lower and lower. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! He yelled. Perhaps some of the boys did beat the gun a trifle, but not many or much. To all intents and purposes, it was one simultaneous blast of destruction that flashed down from 100,000 projectors, each delivering the maximum blast of which it was capable. There was no thought now of service life, of equipment, or of holding anything back for a later effort. They had to hold that blast for only 15 minutes, and if the task ahead of them could not be done in those 15 minutes, it probably could not be done at all. Therefore, it is entirely useless even to attempt to describe what happened then, or to portray the spectacle that ensued when beam met screen. Why try to describe high sea to a man born deaf? Suffice it to say that those patrol beams bore down, and that Helmuth's automatic screens resisted to the limit of their ability. Nor was that resistance small. It was of such power that years later, astronomers observed and recorded a peculiarly behaving nova in star cluster AC 2574736. Had Helmuth's customary staff of keen-eyed, quick-witted lieutenants been at their posts, to reinforce those primary screens with the practically unlimited power which could have been put behind them, his defenses would not have failed, even under the unimaginable force of that titanic thrust. But those lieutenants were not at their posts. The screens of the 26 primary objectives failed, and the 26 stupendous flotillas moved slowly, grandly, voraciously, each along its designated line. Every alarm in Helmuth's dome had burst into frantic warning as the massed might of the Galactic Patrol was first hurled against the 26 vital points of Grand Base. But those alarms clamored in vain. No hands were raised to the switches whose closing would unleash the hellish energies of Boskonians' irresistible projectors. No eyes were upon the sighting devices which would align them against the attacking ships of war. Only Helmuth, in his inner shielded control compartment, was left, And Helmuth was the directing intelligence, the mastermind, not a mere operator. And now that he had no operators to direct, he was utterly helpless. He could see the stupendous fleet of the patrol. He could understand fully its dire menace, but he could neither stiffen his screens nor energize a single beam. He could only sit, grinding his teeth in helpless fury, and watch the destruction of the armament which, if it could only have been in operation, would have blasted those battleships and maulers from the skies, as though they had been so many fluffy bits of thistledown. Time after time he leaped to his feet, as if about to dash across to one of the control stations, but each time he sank back into his seat at the desk. One firing station would be little if any better than none at all. Besides, that accursed Lensman was back of this. He must be, right here in the dome somewhere. He wanted him to leave this desk. That was what he was waiting for. As long as he stayed at the desk, he himself was safe. For that matter, the whole dome was safe. The projector had never been mounted that could break down those screens. No matter what happened, he would stay at the desk. Kinnison, watching, marveled at his fortitude. He himself could not have stayed there, he knew. And he also knew that Helmuth was going to stay. Time was flying. 5 of the 15 minutes were gone. He had hoped that Helmuth would leave that well-protected inner sanctum, with its unknown potentialities. But if the pirate would not come out, the Lensmen would go in. The storming of that inner stronghold was what his new armor had been designed for. In he went, but he did not catch Helmuth napping. Even before he crashed the screens, his own defensive zones burst into furiously caressant activity, and through that flame there came tearing the metallic slugs of a high-caliber machine rifle. Ha! There was a rifle, even though he had not been able to find it. Clever guy, that Helmuth. And what a break that he had taken the time to learn how to hold this suit up against the trickiest kind of machine rifle fire. Kinnison's screens were almost those of a battleship, his armor almost relatively as strong, and he could hold that armor upright. Therefore, through the raging beam of the semi-portable projector he plowed, and straight up that torrent of raging steel he drove his way. And now, from his own mighty projector, against Helmuth's armor, there raved out a beam scarcely less potent than that of a semi-portable. The Lensman's armor did not mount a water-cooled machine rifle. There was a limit to what even that powerful structure could carry. But grimly, with every faculty of his newly enlarged mind concentrated upon that thought-screened, armored head behind the belching gun, Kinnison held his line and forged ahead. Well it was that the Lensman was concentrating upon that screened head, for when the screen weakened slightly and a thought began to seep through it toward an enigmatically sparkling ball of force, Kinnison was ready. He blanketed the thought savagely before it could take form, and attacked the screen so viciously that Helmuth had either to restore full coverage instantly or die then and there. For the Lensman had studied that ball long and earnestly. It was the one thing about that whole base that he could not understand, the one thing, therefore, of which he had been uneasily afraid. But he was afraid of it no longer. It was operated, he now knew, by thought, and no matter how terrific its potentialities might be, it now was and would remain perfectly harmless, for if the pirate chief softened his screen enough to admit a thought, he would never think again. Therefore Kinnison rushed. At full blast he hurled the rifle and crashed full against the armored figure behind it. Magnetic clamps locked and held, and driving projectors furiously ablaze, he whirled around and forced the madly struggling Helmuth back, toward the line along which the bellowing rifle was still spewing forth a continuous storm of metal. Helmuth's utmost efforts sufficed only to throw the Lensman out of balance, and both figures crashed to the floor. Now the madly fighting armored pair rolled over and over, straight into the line of fire. First Kinnison, the bullets whining, shrieking off the armor of his personal battleship, and crashing through her, smashing ringingly against whatever happened to be in the ever-changing line of ricochet. Then Helmuth, and the fierce-driven metal slugs tore in their multitudes through his armor and through his body, riddling his every vital organ. End of chapter 24. Read by Harley James. End of Galactic Patrol by E. E. Smith.